In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good gifts and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so today we wrap up our short intro to the four Gospels, and there won't be class next week because I am taking a Christmas break. So we're going to go through John's Gospel, the structure of John's Gospel briefly tonight, and then we'll pop up for Vespers. So, Matthew, I've described as the Gospel to the Jews, Mark as the Gospel to the disciples, Luke as the Gospel to the nations, and now tonight, John, the Gospel to the gods. And I will explain what that means. But first, a little bit of word about who is this John. He is known by various names. He's referred to by a lot of different things in the early church. He's sometimes referred to as John the Apostle, John the beloved disciple, John the elder, John of Patmos, and then later he's given the title that we tend to call him the most often in the Orthodox Church, John the theologian. So lots of different titles there. He was pretty young when Christ was doing his earthly ministry. It is estimated that he was probably like 19 when Jesus was crucified. So he was really young. He ends up outliving all of the other apostles and dying around the year 98 or 99 as a much older man. And he was kind of the last apostle to write things. Trying to remember off the top of my head, I think I have the order in my head, that his gospel was probably written in the late 80s, and then the letters probably in the 90s. Revelation, we have no real idea when Revelation was written. You either think it was the last book of the New Testament written, or you don't. And how would you even know? It's not like it's obvious. So to put a year on it, I'm going to say Revelation was written in like 98, but I don't know. And really no one does. John is noteworthy. He's the only one of the apostles that did not die from being killed. He died of old age. Not for want of trying. He was once boiled alive in oil, and it just didn't do anything to him. So that was cool. He's also well known for being, so he's the apostle that really took care of what we would now think of as Turkey. Most of the western part of Turkey. Ephesus was the city that he was in and around the most. The Mother of God lived with John for the rest of her earthly life in Ephesus. And several early fathers that are important writers were disciples of John or close. So Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who not only was the child that Jesus put in the midst of the apostles and said, be like this one, he was also a disciple of John. He knew John very, very well. Saint Polycarp of Smyrna, likewise, was a disciple of John. There's a great fun story about him. He joined a gang at one point, and John walked out into the desert to go find this gang of unruly teenage boys that needed hobbies. And he finds them, and he basically slaps Polycarp, and it's just like, get back home. Your mother is worried sick. Like, what are you doing? But they are both direct disciples of John. And then Irenaeus, who was a Greek bishop, who then became a bishop in Lyon, well, what we now call Lyon, France, was a disciple of Polycarp. And so he's kind of like John's spiritual grandchild. And so you have this kind of widespread and three rather important and imposing figures among the early fathers who are all tied sort of directly to John. Not to mention Prochorus, who was John's scribe. So John was illiterate, legitimately illiterate, in a way like Paul could read. John couldn't read, illiterate. Paul was bad at writing for various reasons. John was real illiterate. And so he had Prochorus. Prochorus was this young disciple of his who was also on the Isle of Patmos and wrote down. If you ever see an icon of John the theologian, and it's not uncommon at least to see icons of John the theologian where he's in a cave. That's the cave on Patmos. And it's him sitting there talking, typically while looking up at Jesus' hand coming out of the heavens. And then you'll see a young guy writing a bunch of stuff. That's Prochorus. So, all that being said, John's gospel is written basically after everything else. All of Paul's writings are written. All of the other epistles that are in the New Testament are written. All of the Gospels are written. Acts of the Apostles is written. All of that is done. John writes all of his stuff after everything else is done. And so, pretty rightfully, we put him at the end of everything. It's the last Gospel in canonical order. He has the last letters in canonical order. And, depending on where you put Jude, and the Apocalypse of John or the Revelation of John is the last book of not just the New Testament, but the whole canonical scripture. And that's for a good reason. Next year, when we go through all the stuff in the New Testament that's not the Gospels, we will end with the Apocalypse of John. And I will show you, John's revelation, I should just call it the Revelation to John or something like that, is the capstone of the entire scripture. It basically summarizes the rest of the Bible. It's really hard to see that if you don't know how to read it, which is why I shouldn't call them all cults, but there's one of the reasons why there's hundreds of groups that have all basically been started in the last 200 years because someone read John's Revelation and then didn't really know how to read it correctly. And so they just interpreted it super wildly wrong and then convinced a bunch of other people that they were the ones who were right. And it's sort of not uniquely American, but it feels very sort of uniquely American Christianity to read the book of Revelation and then basically to go nuts and to start a cult. So don't do that. When we get to the book, I'll explain more about, one, how to read it correctly, but also number two, where to go when you're reading a passage and you're like, there are resources. There's a guy who's St. Andrew of Caesarea. He's really important in our reception of the apocalypse. Hello. So that's who John is. His gospel is broken up into 4 chunks. And by 4, I really mean 2. There's 2 chunks. And then there's a prologue and a conclusion. The prologue might be the most famous passage in the entire New Testament. It's the first 18-ish verses of the gospel. After that, you have what is referred to by scholars as the book of signs. And that basically is everything up to the Last Supper. And then everything from the Last Supper and following is the book of glory. And then the last chunk, basically the last chapter, and really it's the last half of the last chapter, is the conclusion. So, in the prologue, John basically sets up the theological vision of his gospel, and I'm going to spend a significant amount of time on that. In the book of signs, in the same kind of vein as we've seen the other gospels do, what John is interested in doing is setting up who this Jesus is and demonstrating the authority that Jesus has. So that when the question comes of, so what am I supposed to do about all of this? The second half of the gospel can assume that you know this Jesus guy pretty well And then basically you get a discourse on like, okay, so like, what do you do with all of this? And then the final conclusion bit is basically a little bit that seems to have been written by Prochorus, that basically is just like, hi, my name's Prochorus. I wrote this. John is very cool, and he tells the truth. And that's basically the conclusion of John's Gospel. It's pretty great. So, one of the reasons I love John's Gospel is I just love that little ending tag at the end. Mostly just because I imagine Prochorus is like 14 or 15 or something, and I just imagine one of my students just being like, oh, John wants me to write down like his stuff. I'm like excited. And at the end, he's just kind of like, I was here. I'm Prochorus. Hello. How are you? I imagine that. I have no idea. Prochorus might be just like, no, I was a very normal person. I was in my 30s. I have no idea. Literally know nothing about Prochorus other than his name. So anyway, the prologue. The, in fact, most famous part of, again, probably the New Testament. I'm going to read it in full from the Orthodox Study Bible, which means I'm reading it from a slightly reworked New King James version, for those of you following along at home. Here's the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me is preferred before me, because he was before me. And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. That's the prologue of John's Gospel. That's where he sets up, here's what I'm going to do. Now, on the one hand, I don't like that translation, but we'll deal with that later. When we get to, like, we're going to deep dive through John's Gospel, there's several parts of that where I'm just like, that's hard to read and know what's going on. But two themes that I want to bring up in this short discussion on John's Gospel is the Word, since that's an important bit for John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What does he mean by Word? And then later, in one of the parts that I don't like the translation of, when he says he will give to them the right to become children of God, the Greek is probably almost certainly better translated, he will give them power to become the sons of God. There's a technical term in there, the sons of God, and so I want to talk about what that means. So, the Word. There are 5 things I want to bring up very briefly about this word and how John is then going to use this. John is not making this up. That is probably the biggest lesson to learn from this, is that John isn't the first person to go on a whole diatribe about the word. He is joining a fairly long-standing, at that point, tradition within Judaism. It is also worth knowing that he's not a Platonist who is using Greek philosophy at any point during his gospel. That John is not. Other people, fine. And actually, at least one of the people I'm going to bring up absolutely is familiar with Plato and Plato's use of this word logos and things like that. Not John. John is an illiterate fisher boy. He has, in fact, not read Plato. By the time he's, however old writing this, 80 or something, he has not read Plato. I can't stress that enough. This is not, do not learn Greek by reading Plato and then read John's Gospel and think, yes, the Logos. No. Read the Old Testament in Greek or whatever, and then read John's Gospel, and then go, the Logos. Much more normal. So, I'm going to jump all the way back to the book of Wisdom. I'm going to jump all the way back to the book of Proverbs, which is part of the wisdom literature. But we're going to jump back to the book of Proverbs, specifically Proverbs chapter 8, which has this whole sort of bit where wisdom speaks for itself and provides this kind of biography. And this is where you get the famous, God bore me before all other things, and I was there when God created everything. And he created everything through me. I provided the structure. Like, wisdom goes on and on and on, describing itself as basically, I was there with God before there was anything else. And this is also the part where I have to dog on the Septuagint, because the Septuagint translation is garbage. And I'm not afraid to say that. Because in the Greek, actually I shouldn't say the Septuagint. Technically it's only Torah. Anyway, in the old Greek translations of this passage, you get it's very clearly in Greek, it says, God made me before all things, etc., etc., etc. And boy, does Arius have a complete heyday with that. That's Arianism in a nutshell, is sorry the Greek translation of the Old Testament messed that line up badly. In Hebrew, it's full on just not that word. It is full on just the normal word for begetting a child, bearing a child. It's a whole problem in the Greek, and I'm so sorry about it. This is why you get weird like passages in Athanasius, where he's like describing things against the Arians, and he goes, well, no, it does say that God created him, but it doesn't mean that. And you're just like, Athanasius, that is a delightfully correct and completely unpersuasive argument in the slightest. Because the Greek, I don't know, if they'd have translated it better, it would have been nice. You wouldn't have had to have Athanasius say things like, I know it says created, but it doesn't mean that there. Trust me. And he's right, but that's not persuasive. Anyway, so this wisdom, this idea that there's kind of this second in God, and that this second comes from God, but isn't one of the creatures, but it isn't created, but God creates through this second, whatever this second one is. And this becomes this really, and then again, this is Proverbs. This is an old book. No matter who you think wrote each individual proverb, it is almost certainly a collection of old sayings and not a recent writing in terms of when the Old Testament is kind of brought together. And so this you'll see discussions of this described as like the second power in heaven. That's Philo's terminology. Who's Philo, you ask? He was a Jewish Middle Platonist in like the 200s BC? 100 or 150s BC, something like that. And he's going to talk about this logos. He is pulling Plato's language, but he's using it to describe this wisdom, this second power in heaven that's floating around in Jewish thought and in the Old Testament scriptures. And he's connecting it with this tradition, which will show up in the Targums. The Targums are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And when they're translations, they're also commentaries because they rewrite parts of it and they add parts to it and things like that, just to explain what's going on. And in the Old Testament, you'll see Yahweh obviously gets spoken of a lot. But there are moments where, like, there's a moment in Moses' story where he asks Yahweh, hey, can I see you? And he says, no, you cannot see me and live. And Moses is like, yeah. And then like 8 verses later, he's like talking face to face with Yahweh. And we're just like, what happened in the last 8 verses? Or in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right before he has the conversation with Abraham or something, he goes, Yahweh asked Yahweh if he should tell Abraham what's about to happen. And then later at Sodom and Gomorrah it says, Yahweh called down fire from Yahweh in heaven. You just keep getting little moments like that where it's just like, what is happening here? The way this is handled in the Targums is every time Yahweh shows up and it is clearly like you cannot look upon Yahweh and live, this is, etc., they leave it alone. It doesn't get weird and crazy. Every time Yahweh shows up and eats food with someone, has a face-to-face conversation with them, is walking around, brandishes a sword, etc., 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 in the Targums, pretty much across the board, they are, at least is added, if not replaced, the word memra, which is the Aramaic word for word. All of these are then described as the word of Yahweh. Or, depending on if you understand how Hebrew works, the actual is going to be like memra Yahweh, which can either mean the word of Yahweh, or it can just mean the word Yahweh, depending on how you want to read it. And in Hebrew, Hebrew and Aramaic, it's fully ambiguous, whether there's an of or not. And so Philo's pulling from this, and he's going to describe this memra. He's going to translate it into Greek because he's writing in Greek, logos, word, and describe it as this second power in heaven, the wisdom of God, the creative power of God, the authority of God, etc., 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 etc. I believe it's also in Philo that he'll also talk about the Spirit of God, and he'll talk about Yahweh having his 2 hands, his right hand of power and his left hand of, I forget what he refers to the left hand being in charge of, but that's language that then gets brought up by several of the fathers and things like that to describe the Son and the Spirit as the 2 hands of the Father in that way. Paul is going to bring this up a lot, especially when he talks about Christ as the image of the Father. The idea here is that God the Father is not seeable. But God the Son makes him known. And so Paul will refer to him as the express image of the Father. Jesus is just going to tell Philip in John's Gospel, have I been with you this whole time, Philip, and you don't know? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And that's using language of sonship. So son, this language of being a son of something, is basically to say that you're the image of something. A person is someone's son if, when you look at that person, you see their father. That's kind of the idea of the word sonship. So when the Jews refer to themselves as the sons of Abraham, they're not just saying we're genetically related to Abraham because they didn't know what genetics were. What they're saying is, we are of the family of Abraham. We are like Abraham. We have inherited the promises to Abraham, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why you can have people who are Jews, people who are Israelites, who aren't ethnically related to each other. Most of the Levites are Egyptians, or at least have Egyptian names in the book of Exodus. The tribe of Dan is almost all Greeks, probably. There's all sorts of stuff like that. And so this view of sonship, Philo is referring to then this logos, which he's pulling from a lot of places, especially just the tradition, but also specifically this figure in Proverbs, and is going to refer to this figure basically as the Son of God, etc., and these sorts of things. Paul is going to use the language of imagery, and then especially later, like 600s AD, St. Maximus the Confessor is going to pick up this language, and he's great. He's remarkably difficult to read and understand, but he's going to describe this Logos, Christ, as the pattern of all creation. So we say that the Father has created everything through the Son. What we also mean is that all of creation looks like Jesus. All of creation is reflecting God. And he's going to refer to the patterns as logi, words. And then he's going to say and then all of those words are like whispers of the one word, the Logos, which is how God, the Father, makes himself known. It's through the Son. So, when John shows up and says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, everyone goes, oh yeah. Kind of. Like if you're Jewish, you just kind of go, yeah, I have heard such talk before. This is not brand new to me in the slightest. But I do now know what you're going to talk about for the rest of your book, because you've made it very clear. I'm going to talk about this second part of it. It's when, and he goes through and he says, and he was with him in the beginning, and all things were made through him, and nothing was made except if it was made through him. And what was in this word was life. And the life was the light of the world. It enlightens everyone coming into the world. And he came into the world, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended it or overcome it, depending how you work with that Greek word. And everyone's just like, yes, this makes sense. I love God. Like, this is who I'm talking about. And then he comes up and says, and there was a man sent by God whose name was John. He's talking about John the Baptist. And everyone's like, yes, John the Baptist was also very cool. We agree. And he came, and he wasn't the light, but he came as a witness to the light, so that everyone would believe in the light through him, etc., etc., etc. And then it's in verse 14 that John drops the specific, and the Logos became sarx. And sarx is flesh. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That's the bombshell moment in John's Gospel where he says, verse 14, I'm talking Jesus is the second power in heaven. That's the claim. It's not the revolutionary claim is not that there is a second person in God. The revolutionary claim is that this guy that we met is the second power in heaven, etc. So, I'm also going to ruin Sunday school here in a second. The Greek word that we always translate as only begotten probably does not mean only begotten, at all. It doesn't have enough of the letter N in it, which sounds remarkably silly, but bear with me. Monogenes is this Greek word, and the genes there is not unrelated to the word for begetting, but you would expect it to be monogenes with two N's there if it was only begotten to really be from the verb begetting. This is more like genes, kind of like the word that becomes genre in French and then comes into English, a kind or a type of thing. Monogenes really means unique, one of a kind. There's something special about this one. And that's going to be my transition into talking about the sons of God. So and to those who did believe in him, so he came to his own did not receive him, but to those who did receive him, he gave them the power to become sons of God. The sons of God, so we've already talked about the word son here, really means like the images of, the ones who are like God. This is pretty typical Old Testament language for angels. The sons of God. If you're interested in what this looks like in the Old Testament, I recommend 3 Kingdoms, chapter 22, Isaiah chapter 6, Job chapter 1, and the beginning of Psalm 81/82, depending on your numbering. So when he says he has given them, I'm going to pull so when we call Jesus the Son of God, Frankly, Son of God is not the special title. Unless you capitalize it, but obviously that doesn't mean anything back then. Because that's what you would call any of the angels. What's special about him is that he is the unique, one of a kind, special. There's something different about this one. Son of God. And among the council of the sons of God, he sits on the throne. Now, why does he sit on the throne? Because he's the only one of the sons of God that has been begotten by the Father and not created. So there's nothing wrong with using this word. There's nothing wrong with saying Christ is the only begotten Son of the Father. That's 100% correct. It is tangentially related to the word that we keep translating as only begotten, but it is not unrelated. And so, lest I get accused of saying you shouldn't call Jesus the only begotten Son of God, you should. That is a true statement. It's just that the Greek word monogenes is a broader in scope. It doesn't just mean only begotten. Otherwise, if you read Greek literature, you're going to find weird stuff where someone has a very only begotten painting hanging up in their house. And it's like, what? It just means unique. It's the normal Greek word for unique here. John Damascene goes on a whole 3-paragraph diatribe on this word in chapter 8 of the exact exposition of the faith. And he goes into the whole thing with the double N and stuff like that. So if you love that kind of pedantry, you should read John Damascene. He's very good for that. In any case, so you have this unique Son of God who will give those who believe in him the power to become sons of God. So you have the one who sits on the throne in heaven, who has been appointed by God, who can turn you into another member of this group of the gods. Which basically means they can make you like Elijah. They can make you like Isaiah. This person can make you like the prophets. That's what makes you a prophet, is that you have seen God. Which is why John then goes down and says, no one has ever seen God. And he doesn't mean that every time in the Old Testament that it says someone looked at God, that it was like lying or wrong. It just means that in John's gospel, we have to understand that basically when you see the word God in John's gospel, he means the Father. And that's pretty typical for just Orthodox theology. If we just say God, we basically mean the Father. The Father is God, really in himself, properly God. The Son and the Spirit are God because of the Father. It's not like there's some amorphous thing out there that's the divine nature and that the Father and the Son and the Spirit come from that. It's that there's the Father who is divine, whose nature is godly. And he has the Son and the Spirit, not by creating them as others, but by begetting them of his own self, which is why they share the same nature as him. And so they are all God. And the divine nature cannot be split into things like that. So when John says God, he basically means God the Father. Frankly, in the Orthodox Church, when we say God, we really properly would mean the Father. If we want to really say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you're more likely to see that's the Trinity. But if you're ever reading any Orthodox literature and it just says God, properly, they're probably talking about the Father. So, no one has ever seen the Father, but the Son, who is in the heart of the Father, has made him known. That's how John ends his prologue. And then, of course, the next thing is, so about this Jesus guy. This is how he's made him known. So that's what the rest of the gospel is about. Any questions on that prologue before I now fly through John's gospel, partly because we will go into detail on John's gospel later in the year?
So
yes.
Is God being referred to as God, is that part of the Filioque? Is that what you call it?
Filioque?
Filioque controversy that happened with the Catholic Church. Like, do they believe that differently?
So, the Filioque properly refers to, well, the history of the Filioque is long and difficult and confusing. And there's developments. So I'll preempt all of that. The dogmatic statements of the Catholic Church and the dogmatic statements of the Orthodox Church that the Filioque matters to at all basically boil down to a difference in our understanding of whether or not the Son is a cause of the Holy Spirit. Our understanding is that God the Father is the cause. He causes a hypostatic property of God the Father, which means only the Father has that. The other persons are not cause of divinity in any way, shape, or form. He is the cause of the Son's divinity. He is the cause of the Spirit's divinity. What the Spirit and the Son's relationship to each other, technically not talked about vis-a-vis that. Just that the Spirit does not cause the Son. The Son does not cause the Spirit. They still have an eternal relationship with each other. And that's where you get the language in the early fathers of the Spirit proceeding from the Father through the Son, or proceeding from the Father and resting in the Son, etc., etc., etc. The Son's relationship to the Spirit is not the same as the Father's relationship to the Spirit. That's what we find. Frankly, I would also say that having read St. Augustine, which is the early church father you go to if you want to show the Filioque, frankly, I think it's what Augustine is saying too, when he says that the Spirit proceeds from the Father properly and from the Son in a shared way. I'm like, well, yeah. He has a different relationship to the two of them. The way he proceeds from the Father is just different from the way he proceeds from the Son. Sure, great. He proceeds from the Father as though the Father were cause, and he proceeds from the Son like a through, or an in, or a with, or a whatever preposition you feel like using in human language that doesn't work. So the perennial teaching of basically all of the fathers is that the Spirit is caused only by the Father, because the Son can't have one of the Father's properties without the Son being the Father. Whatever the Son's relationship to the Spirit is, it's different from the Father's. Whereas Catholic dogma says that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son as though from a single principle, which is to say the Spirit's relationship to the Father is the same as the Spirit's relationship to the Son as far as causality, which makes the Son a cause. And now the biggest problem with that is you now have something that you are saying of exactly two persons of the Trinity, which means you aren't saying it's part of the divine nature, wherein you would say it of all three of them, nor is it a hypostatic property, wherein it would be true of exactly one of them. You're saying it's true of exactly two of them, which has one of three possible logical outcomes. First possible logical outcome, you are saying it of exactly one person, which is the normal way you would do something, and the Son and the Father are now the same person, which the Catholic Church clearly does not teach, so we won't accuse them of that. Or you're saying it of exactly all of the persons of the Trinity because it's a natural property, which now means that the Holy Spirit is not God, which the Catholic Church doesn't teach, and so we won't accuse them of that. The problem is there is no real third option. And so the Catholic Church teaches that all three of them are God. They do not err in that way. But they have this thing where it's just like, that doesn't work, and it's not what the Father's taught, and it's not necessary. Because the Spirit can proceed from the Father, and he can proceed from the Son. That's fine. It just has to not be in the same way. It has to be from the Father through the Son, or from the Father in the Son, or something like that, to preserve the hypostatic differences between the three of them. So there's my shortest possible explanation of the Filioque. So
it's a mind bender.
Yeah, and it's a lot to think about, and it's one of those things where because it's so hard to talk about, and because very few people actually have a really good idea. Either the two errors in talking about the Filioque tend to become one or the other. Either one, they don't really ever learn what the other side actually teaches from their perspective. So you get this into well, either you say the Spirit isn't God, or you say that the Father and the Son are the same person. And I was but they don't say either of those things. Logically, there's issues, but they don't claim either of those, and we should not accuse them of something that they don't do. Don't do that. Or, on the other hand, what ends up happening is people just start saying all kinds of nonsense, and they don't even teach orthodoxy correctly. And they're just well, the Spirit doesn't have any relationship to the Son. Eternal. And I was So that's also not what the Father sees. You cannot do that. That's also heresy. Like, that's a whole problem. That might be worse, frankly, than the filioque. So those are the two pitfalls to really not fall into. There's a book, if you're really interested. There's a really in-depth academic book that I could recommend. But for the sake of reading through John's Gospel, that is where I will end chatting about the filioque. Perhaps one day, actually, at the end of next year, I'll have a class that will basically center on the filioque, because it'll center on the 8th Council. So, the Book of Signs. It's called the Book of Signs because there's 7 signs. Here's the 7 signs, briefly. The wedding at Cana, healing a nobleman's son with just a word, healing the guy at the pool of Bethesda with the angel that stirs the water up, feeding 5,000, walking on water, healing the man born blind, and raising Lazarus from the dead. Which is great. Last one to finish on is to just resurrect some other person. Those are the 7 signs of the Book of Signs. I want to get into a little bit of detail on the first 5-ish chapters. In the first chapter, we meet John the Baptist. We see John the Baptist a lot. And then we're introduced to 6 of the apostles. And everything is the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. You get a lot of that language in John. So you get John the Baptist, and then Andrew, Peter, James, and John are shown Jesus by John the Baptist. And the way they talk to each other is, well, come and see. And on the next day, Philip sees all this, goes to Nathanael, and he says, Nathanael, we found the Messiah. And Nathanael's like, ugh. And he goes, come and see. You get this come and see language. That'll be used one other time in John's Gospel very poignantly. And it's at the raising of Lazarus, where Jesus says, where have they laid him? And they tell Jesus, come and see. And they show him the body. Nathanael then shows up, and Jesus is just like, I love this guy. He's great. And then on the 3rd day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. We are told way then at the end of John's Gospel that Nathanael is from Galilee. And this is Nathanael's wedding. So Nathanael, the guy who was under the fig tree, is just like, Nazareth is the worst town in the world. I've been there, trust me. And he shows up, and Jesus is just like, you're great. And then the next verse is, there's a wedding in Cana. This is Nathanael's wedding. So probably. This is not like a known dogma or whatever, but it's probably Nathanael's wedding. And then right after the wedding at Cana is the cleansing of the temple in John's Gospel. We waste no time getting to the cleansing of the temple in chapter 2. And then you get Nicodemus. And then you get the woman at the well. And then you get the pool of Bethesda and a whole diatribe on the Father and the Son. And what I want to chart is just here's how John works. He is setting up all this language of, you need to come and see Jesus. You need to come and see Jesus. You need to come and see this for yourself. And then Jesus walks right into the heart of the matter for everyone's lives. He goes to Nathanael's wedding. And he reveals that he's God and totally steals the show. And then he doesn't tell anyone because his hour has not come yet. And then he goes to the temple and he just walks in like he owns the place. Pun intended. And it's just this is not how the temple should be. And everyone just oh my gosh, this guy just thinks he can come in and tell us how the temple's supposed to be. And then you get Nicodemus and the woman of the well, and there are important notes. Nicodemus, we are told, comes to Jesus in the middle of the night. The woman at the well, Photini, meets Jesus in the middle of the day. These are 2 different experiences of Jesus. Nicodemus shows up in the middle of the night, and the whole conversation he has with Jesus is about being born. So we've just had wedding language. Well, first off, we're talking about the begotten Son of God, who has become a human. And then he goes to a wedding. And then after the wedding, he goes and he clears the temple out. And then he talks to one of the people who's a leader in the Jewish community about birth. And then he goes and talks to some random Samaritan lady about marriage. And then, after that, he's going to show up, he's going to heal a guy on the Sabbath, and everyone's going to get all antsy about him, and he's going to say, the Father and the Son do all of the exact same things. If you knew the Father, then you would know who I am. That's how the opening of John's goes. So lots of wedding imagery. The way that this is being brought about, all the language of salvation in John's gospel focuses on wedding imagery and birth imagery. And your ears should perk up every time one of those shows up. Family, wedding, birth, etc., etc., etc. So anytime there's sonship or daughtership, or there's like the father and the son, or there's like wedding imagery, that's how John is. That's how he's kind of fueling the discussions of all these things, especially when you get into the Last Supper discourse, and he's constantly talking about things like, I am the vine and you are the branches. Like, you are connected to me. You grow out of me. Or Philip, the Father, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. He's using all of this imagery of stuff. He talks about when I am crucified, etc., it will be like a woman giving birth. Pain that becomes joy. When he's on the cross and he says, John, behold your mother. Woman, behold your son. Like, that is how John is always framing his theology, is in this wedding childbirth language. And so Nicodemus, one of the Pharisees, who is a saint and is wonderful, but he is regularly referred to as coming to Jesus by night. And the conversations that Jesus always seems to have with him are things like, you just really don't get it, do you, Nicodemus? Like, it's just not making sense to you. And the way that Nicodemus is going about trying to use his mind to reason through and figure it out and parse it all through, and then once he understands Jesus, then Jesus is like, and it's not working for you, Nicodemus. You can't just use human power to get the Messiah and then start following him. That's not how this works. Following Christ, the example we were given right before Nicodemus is people saw that Jesus was holy, and other people that they knew were holy and from God said, that's Jesus you should do, and they followed him. And it was by following him that they came to understand him. And we get language like that where Jesus says, tear down this temple all you want, I'll raise it up in 3 days. Everyone has no idea what's going on. And then it says later, after he was raised from the dead, then his disciples thought back at what he said and goes, oh, I get it now. It's the following of Christ that actually helps you understand him. This is one of the reasons why, for those of you who are catechumens, there is a certain level of, if there are some things that do not make sense, the answer is, yeah, that's correct. And they won't. They literally will not make sense. Some things just, God will not reveal them to you and clarify them before you're baptized. It's a thing. And he does for a reason. And some people he calls to a certain, some people need more going on up here before they're ready for that. God is willing to work with each of us to figure out how to get each of us close to him. But there is a certain level of, yeah, of course it won't make sense. You aren't baptized. How could you possibly expect to fully understand Christ without being joined to him, without being a member of his body, and things like that? I'll save it. I'll control myself and save it. I wanted to go into Fotini's story and the woman at the well. I will save it for when we get into John's gospel sort of more deeply. But I wanted to bring up what I think is my favorite line in all of John's gospel. So, spoilers, you should keep coming to class, because I'll tell you about it. At the end of the first 5 chapters, you get a whole discussion where Jesus basically says, Father, me, one. And he goes on and on about it. He will do this several times. I think that there's something to this, that things lead up to those moments. And so right before the last thing that happens in that sort of first chunk of John's gospel, that right before Jesus then says, the Father and I are one, and kind of wraps up that section and goes into the next one, is the man at the pool of Bethesda. And what Jesus says to the man at the pool of Bethesda is great. This is a guy who's been laying next to a pool of water for 38 years, which has symbolic meaning. I'll get into that later, when in 2 months later. And Jesus walks, and he's been laying there for 38 years trying to get into this pool of water that heals people every so often. And Jesus walks up to him and says, "Do you want to get better?" Which, obviously he does. But there's something about Jesus walks up to him and says, "Do you really want to get better?" And that's a very important question. Because there is a certain level of, well, yeah, of course I do. But then there's also but do you really want to get better? Because getting better is hard work. Getting better will demand things of you. Getting better will have to mean your entire life has to change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This guy's going to have to get a job. Because people will not just hand him money because he's crippled. Right now, people are just handing him money because he's crippled and he can whatever. He's going to have to work. That's a huge life change for this guy. He's going to there's expectations. And so those kind of rhetorical questions, Jesus being rabbi, and he does rabbi a lot in John's gospel. He's going to, well, do you really want to get better? And the man says yes, and Jesus says fine. And he makes him better. And we'll get more into that story later, but I just wanted to point out, as you get to then these sections where Jesus goes on about the Father and the Son, what's going on around those matters a lot. Those are kind of your markers in the beginning. Then, chapters 6 through 8, you get the feeding of the 5,000, bread of life discourse, lots of disputing with the Pharisees and among the Pharisees, the woman caught in adultery, the light of the world, Abraham's, etc. And then you get another discourse on the Father honoring the Son. Chapter 9, the whole chapter is the story of the man born blind. And then chapter 10, the Good Shepherd discourse. And then another thing on the Father and the Son are one. Then, chapter 11, raise Lazarus from the dead. Plot to kill Jesus. And then you get the Palm Sunday, etc. entry. And then you get another thing on the Father and the Son. And so it's kind of speeding up. You get lots of chapters and then a thing, and then a few chapters and a thing, and then it's speeding up. And then Book of Glory, chapters 13 through 20. First half of that is the Last Supper discourse, which I will go into absolutely no detail on here until we get to it later. Then the betrayal, the arrest, the various trials, crucifixion, the very famous woman, behold your son, John, behold your mother, death, the stabbing, the blood and the water coming out, his burial. And then chapter 20 and 21 are 5 of the 11 Matins Gospels. 5 of them come from John's Gospel, and they are these. The finding of the tomb empty in John's Gospel. Him talking to Mary Magdalene as she thought he was the gardener. Thomas needing to have sort of real confirmation of Jesus. The miraculous catch of fish, and then Peter being restored as the chief of the apostles. Those are the 5 of the 11 Matins Gospels are all from John's Gospel. And then at the very end, you get, again, Procre saying, and this is the testimony of the beloved disciple, and we can trust him because of who he is. And we could write a lot more. Jesus obviously did a whole bunch more things, but if we tried to write all of them down, the world would not be able to contain the books. End of manuscript. And that's John's Gospel. So, to recap very briefly, you get the prologue, the very intense theological prologue. The Book of Signs, which I like to stress the Book of Signs a lot because I think John is doing some really unique stuff in there. There's some really good symbolism in there that has to do with light and darkness, wedding imagery, birth imagery, these sorts of things. Then that culminates in the raising of Lazarus from the dead and him being born out of the earth again, which is it's Adam imagery. Lazarus walks up out of the ground. Then you get Jesus' discussion with the disciples, and it's only the apostles. It's like the intimate discussion of what's really the point of this Christian life. And it's that part that I use when I want to talk about this and say this is the gospel to the gods, is that Son of God imagery at the beginning, but also when he talks to the apostles about what it means to be a disciple. Because we've seen that in all the Gospels. It's always, this is who Jesus is, here's the things he did, and now here's what you have to do to be a disciple. In John's gospel, that discussion of what it means to be a disciple is we are given basically a glimpse of the most intimate discussion he has with his most intimate disciples. And we get chapters of it. And it's so wonderful that we were given that. And then you get sort of your classic, the passion and death and resurrection. But then obviously the resurrection accounts in John are beloved by the church, and they include stories that are unique to John and things like that. So any questions on John's whole gospel before we jump up for Vespers?
It's the most mysterious one.
It's often described as that, the most theological. Shallow enough for a child to play in and deep enough to swallow an elephant. That's how St. Augustine describes it.